Hello, my name's Laura Rhodes. I work as a Blue Badge guide. I live in Newcastle, and working as a guide, I travel through Newcastle, but I also travel throughout the northeast of England, working with visitors to the region and showing them what we've got to offer here in the northeast. So today I'd like to take you on a virtual journey through Tyneside, and I'm going to show you Hadrian's Wall on Tyneside. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen with you, and now you can see an image of Hadrian's Wall stretching across the countryside here. This is our typical view of Hadrian's Wall. We can see the wall with the soldiers walking on the top of the wall. The little square building that you can see here is a turret, which was a sort of defensive watchtower, and then beyond that in the distance a mile castle, slightly larger than a turret. But the main feature here is the whole wall system that you can see. We don't really know exactly what the wall looked like, but one of our images of the wall is what we can see here at Wall's End. And if you go down to Segedunum, to the Roman fort at Wall's End, you can see a reconstruction of the wall. And this is what it looks like here. So it's about 15 feet, 20 feet tall in various places. But you can see along the top of the wall here an idea of some idea of what it might have looked like, with crenellations, like a castle on the top, with a little walkway down behind. But to be honest, we don't actually know if that was what it really looked like. What we've got in the countryside, when you go out into Hadrian's Wall in the countryside, is this is what you see. We don't see anywhere where Hadrian's Wall stands at its full height. So the idea of a walkway is one theory, but another theory was it maybe had some sort of cover on the top, some sort of covered, like a roof on the top. We actually just don't know. But what you've got here is an image of Hadrian's Wall in Northumberland, taken near Howstead's Fort in Northumberland. And you can see the wall snaking across the countryside, following very much the line of the hills. Now, the Roman builders were really quite clever. They didn't necessarily construct the wall in the lowland areas. They wanted to use the high hills, so that they used the vantage points, the advantage of being high up on the hill. So using this natural outcrop of windsill, volcanic rock, they built the wall on the top of this outcrop to give a fabulous vantage point across the countryside. So if you go out into Northumberland, this is the sort of view that you'll see. But more likely in Newcastle, I'll show you some of the structures that you can see in Newcastle itself. But Hadrian's Wall was built from one coast to the other, from the east coast, from Newcastle and Segedunum, all the way across country to Bowness on Solway in the west of the country on the coast. And it stretched 80 Roman miles. Now, the measurement is a little bit different today. The measurement today is 73 modern miles. That's because the Roman mile was slightly shorter than the modern mile, because they paced out the 1,000 paces was a mile. But today, if you go out into the countryside, this is typical of what you can see. And what we've got here is another more modern image, a reconstructed image of what Hadrian's Wall possibly looked like. So you can see the length of the wall here, this entire wall stretching as far as the eye can see. But don't just think of Hadrian's Wall as being a wall. As well as the wall, can you see this system of ditches that were associated with the wall? This is looking north. This is looking from the north, rather. You can see a big defensive ditch, a big deep defensive ditch. And then very close to the wall, these defensive sort of spikes. These were sort of perhaps wooden spikes that were sunk into the ground, so that if anybody was attacking the wall, it was just another way of slowing them down. Now, on the other side of the wall, on the south side of the wall, on the side that was inhabited by the Romans, there was a system of roads, a network of roads, but also another ditch that was slightly to the south of the wall, which was known as the Vallum Ditch. Now, if you go out into the countryside today, this is more likely what you'll see, because over the course of 2,000 years, much of the wall has actually been removed. It's been taken away to build houses, it's been taken away to build farms, and in one stretch of Northumberland, there's a road sitting on top of Hadrian's Wall. During the time of the Jacobite rebellions, it was necessary to build a military road from one side of the country to the other, and rather start a new construction. What happened was Hadrian's Wall was just demolished, and then the footings of that were used for the building of the military road, which you can see running across Northumberland today. So this is more likely what you'll see if you go out into the countryside. However, when you're in Newcastle and Tyneside, we don't often see these hilly features, these ditches and these features, because of the years and years, 2,000 years almost of urban development in Newcastle. So this is not necessarily what we'll see in the city, but this is a view of Hadrian's Wall out in the countryside. Now, this is a map here taken from Newcastle University of Hadrian's Wall. You can see Newcastle and the east coast of the east side of the wall over here, the wall stretching across all the way beyond Carlisle to Bowness on Solway. There was actually a wall structure built across the middle of the country, but towards the west side at Bowness, it tended to be little fortlets that was sort of on the seaside rather than massive stone structures. It was wooden fortlets, a system of earthworks. But the main part that we're concentrating on today is on the east side of the wall here in Tyneside. And one of the questions you might ask is, why is it here? Why have we got Hadrian's Wall? Well, prior to Hadrian becoming the emperor, the Roman Empire really had been expanding, and it expanded into Britain, into the north of Britain, but it was also expanding around the Mediterranean. And it was expanding so quickly that it was quite difficult in some areas to keep control. So the idea, and it's thought to be the idea of Hadrian, was in the north to stop that expansion by just building a wall and saying, this is the edge of the Roman Empire. Anything beyond that wall is the land of the barbarians, and it's not really something we want to control. So that's exactly what happened. This wall was built from coast to coast and marked the northern edge of the Roman Empire. Now, just a few years before the wall was built, about 50 years before the wall was built, you can see this grey line here just south of the wall, and that marks what was known as the Stane Gate. And the Stane Gate, it wasn't really a wall, it was more like a road that was garrisoned. There were soldiers along that road marking the edge of the empire, but it was Hadrian's idea to build something a little bit more permanent and to go further north along that line of those hills that we saw and build Hadrian's Wall. So these things are still visitable today, where they're marked in black. These are the forts along the wall, because the soldiers actually lived in forts. They lived in structures that were built specifically to house them, but also they were close to any sort of attack. If anything was happening from the north, they were able to be allowed onto the wall really quickly to be able to fend off any attack. So what we're going to be doing today is just looking at the east side of the wall, of the furthest east of the wall. And if you look at the map now, this is the map of the east end of the wall. You can see here the mouth of the Tyne here at Tynemouth, and the River Tyne snaking backwards, and right in the centre, the town of Newcastle, later to become the city of Newcastle. So what we're going to be investigating today is the wall in this urban area, and you can see as we zoom in the city of Newcastle now, and the river becoming one of the most important places where, when Hadrian's Wall was built, this was the defensive part for the river. So let's move on to, let me see, there we go. This is a slide of Newcastle. Newcastle itself, you might be surprised to know that Hadrian's Wall was actually started in Newcastle. Now, we don't know the exact site of the bridge, but the whole idea of building the wall and building a fortress here was to guard the site of a bridge. And it's thought that the Roman bridge rather, stood on the site of where the swing bridge now is today, right in the middle of Newcastle. So you can see up on the hill there, up above the swing bridge, you can see the castle of Newcastle, the square-shaped building with a flag flying on top. Next door to that, the cathedral. And if you look over to the left, the coat of arms of Newcastle has 3 castles in the centre here. And those 3 castles are supposedly representing the 3 castles that were on this site. The very first, built during the Roman times, it wasn't really a castle so much, just a little fortress. And then the second castle to be built here was built during the time of William the Conqueror, and that was built on the site of the Roman castle, became known as Newcastle upon the Tyne. And then a little bit later, the stone castle that you can see today was built in the 1200s. So those 3 castles representing Newcastle's history on that coat of arms there. Now, having a look close in at the castle of Newcastle, the centre of the picture here, you can just see the swing bridge. The cross in the centre of the picture is the swing bridge, Armstrong's bridge from the 1870s, which allows shipping up and down the river. But just above the swing bridge, just to the north of the swing bridge, and right in the centre of the picture here is the castle of Newcastle, the castle keep. The whole castle took up this entire site all the way down to the river, but over the years much of the castle has been demolished, and you can see running right the way through the middle of that is the East Coast Main Line. So poor old Newcastle's castle is divided into two now. So you've got the keep of the castle, that big square building, and next to it on the other side of the railway tracks, the entrance, the main gateway into the castle. But zooming right into the castle and looking beside the castle is actually some of the original Roman remains of Newcastle's first fortress that was here. This picture was taken from the castle looking down into the pavement, and laid out in the pavement below the castle and in the area around the castle keep. You can just see the line. You can't see any buildings from the Roman era, but you can see the line of some of the Roman buildings on that site. Now here's another map of Newcastle and the surrounding areas, and it's just showing down to the coast on this side. And although we can't see much in Newcastle of the Roman wall itself, it's very, very obvious in the area surrounding Newcastle, because if you can just follow the line of the roads here, over to the east you've got the Shields Road from the city centre going over to the east, and at the west you've got the West Road. Sorry, the West Road. I lost my track of thought there for a second. The West Road, Westgate Road, following the line of the Roman road going out of town to the west. So these are really obvious in the landscape today. Although there's not much in terms of archaeology in the centre of Newcastle, you can still follow that line of the Roman wall as it left the city in each direction. Now, you wonder how do we know so much about Hadrian and the Roman wall? And one of the ways that we have of knowing what happened during Roman times is looking at things like this. This is an inscription that was found at Arbea, and this celebrates the bringing of an aqueduct, a watercourse to Arbea. So one of the ways we have of finding out about the history of that era, is the inscriptions, is the writing that we have. And just a little bit after the time of the Romans, there were also a number of biographies written, particularly of the emperors, the famous people. So we've got some written inscriptions and we've got some written history. And not that far away from Newcastle, going over towards the west of the country, we've got Vindolanda. And at Vindolanda, some of the writing tablets that were found at Vindolanda, little wooden writing tablets were found, which tell the history of what went on a very much a day-to-day basis. But much more likely to be found are these big stone inscriptions, very, very important inscriptions along the wall, quite often along the building of the wall. As the wall was being built by different legions on the wall, they left little stones in the wall, a little bit like graffiti, just to say who it was that built that part of the wall. And these can still be seen in some parts of Hadrian's Wall today. So one way of knowing what went on is looking at inscriptions. But another way of finding out what's going on under the ground is using this kind of technology called LiDAR, which is a type of radar. And this isn't actually an image of Tyneside. This is an image of Vindolanda, which is much further over to the west. This kind of technology was developed originally for measuring floodplains and water levels, but you can see it very, very useful for archaeologists because you can actually see what's going on in the landscape. What you don't see here, though, is how old things are, because you can see the outline here in the centre of a Roman fort. You can see that very typical playing card shape of a Roman fort. Over here on the left-hand side, there's some other kind of earthwork, but it's not until you actually go on site that you realise that this is the clearing for the car park. This is nothing to do with the Romans whatsoever, and actually the little buildings there are the entrance building at Vindolanda, the place where you pay your admissions. So, you know, you have to use this in conjunction with other types of research. What is very obvious here is the line of the road. Can you see at the top there, the line of the Roman road, which was known as the Staingate, and that was the road that was pre-existing before Hadrian's Wall was built. So inscriptions using this kind of ground-penetrating radar, but another and probably the most important way to find out what went on is archaeology, is actually digging and excavating. And this is a photograph taken from the excavations at Wall's End that took place over the last probably 5 or 6 years as part of a community archaeology project which was called Wall Quest. And a lot of the slides and photographs that I've used today are from that project, because it was exactly what it sounds. It was a quest to find Hadrian's Wall in Tyneside. Because although we have got lots of Hadrian's Wall in existence, if you go out into the countryside, you can see that wall standing. Because of 2,000 years of urban building and 2,000 years of industry in this part of the country, there really wasn't an awful lot left above ground. So it's only really when there's an excavation, when there's a chance to excavate, that you can see what's underground. And at that point, that's when the artifacts can be found, the little things that you find in museums, the things that give you the history of people's lives in Roman times. So this is part of the Wall Quest project, which the project is completed now. The project is finished. It's all been written up. But what you can do now is they've written a book following the line of Hadrian's Wall on Tyneside, so you can actually walk the line of the wall on Tyneside. If you do decide to do the Hadrian's Wall path, the national trail, that doesn't actually follow the line of the wall, because in parts of Tyneside there isn't a great deal to see, so it follows the line of the river. But this little book that you can get from Tyne and Wear Archives, or you can get it online, tells you a bit about the line of the wall as it goes through Tyneside. So coming from Newcastle, the wall was started in Newcastle. The wall was actually started in Newcastle and built westwards from Newcastle. And then a few years later, a little extension was added to take the wall from Newcastle down to the coast, almost to the coast, at Segedunum. And Segedunum in Latin means a strong fortress. And you can see here at the very, very eastern end of Hadrian's Wall, in the background is the white building, which is the bathhouse at Segedunum, the reconstructed bathhouse at Segedunum. And then a lovely little milepost there telling you how far it is to get to Rome from there. So quite a distance. And this is a shot taken from the top of the tower at Segedunum. Now you can see down to the centre and to the left-hand side here, the river. And then this inlet in the river is part of the shipyard. It's part of the dry dock of Swan Hunter shipyard, because Segedunum, the Roman fortress, was built over many, many years, and this was the site of Swan Hunter. And it wasn't until Swan Hunter was demolished quite recently that this area could be excavated. And you can see very, very extensive excavations here. There's nothing at Segedunum that's above ground level, because this was built over by the shipyard, and there were also rows and rows of houses here. But you can see a layout of the centre of the fort here, and actually part of the fort was on the other side of the road here. You see the road crossing, and then the other part of the fort was on this side. Away in the distance, down on the left-hand side, you can see the little white building there of the reconstructed bathhouse at Segedunum. But if you come back here 2,000 years ago, this is what it would have looked like. Segedunum fort here, again, pretty typical square-shaped or rectangular-shaped fort with the wall stretching out to the west side of it. And there was a little tiny extension part of the wall down onto the river. And there could have been some sort of temple at the end here, maybe something dedicated to the Emperor Hadrian. And you can see around the fortress lots of other little buildings. And this was known as the vicus. And the vicus was like a village. It's where the word village came from. So in the vicus, this is typically where a lot of the women and the children that were associated with the soldiers would have lived. The forts tended to be male only. But now Segedunum, it's been very well excavated, and it now has a museum on site. It's a great place to visit to find out a little bit about the history of the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall. And what I've got to show you now is quite a fun reconstruction of a typical Roman fort. Along Hadrian's Wall, and actually in other parts of the Roman Empire, across Germany and across southern Europe, you will find forts that look very, very much like this. What you can see here is not exactly to scale, this fort, but what you can see here, again, that rectangular sort of square-shaped fort surrounded by high walls with a little gateway on each side of the fort, and we've got what's known as a twin portaled gateway. You can see two little gateways in there. In the centre of the fort was the headquarters building, this tall building with the terracotta tiled roof. This was the headquarters building. This is where the sort of nerve centre of each of the forts, and this would have met on a daily basis to have been given their regulations for the day and their work orders for the day. Next door to that was another quite high quality building, and this would have been the commanding officer's house. This was the house where the man who was in charge of the fort lived. And then surrounding that, the whole of the rest of the fort just about taken up by these rows and rows and rows of barrack blocks. So the commanding officer got a really fancy house to live in, but the majority of the soldiers just lived in these really basic blocks. You can see at the back here, the building with the black roof would have been some sort of granary. It was reckoned that for most of the forts, they kept a year's worth of food in stock. So big storage facility for the food for the men living on the fort. And there would have possibly been workshops and other buildings inside. Every fort's a little bit different depending on the purpose of the fort, but most of them have just about the same layout. In Chester's fort, for example, on Hadrian's Wall, that was a cavalry fort. So that was a fort that had horses as well as soldiers. So some of the buildings there have been identified as stables. But this is the general layout of a fort on Hadrian's Wall. And this was done as part of a project. It's a group called Brick to the Past. And they're a historical group who reenact, if you like, but they rebuild periods of history using Lego. So this is a Lego model that you're looking at here. And this was based on Howstead's fort, way up in the hills in Northumberland. Now, bringing you right back to almost to the modern times, on the site of Wallsend, some of you might remember this pub, which was very popular with the people who worked in the shipyards. It was called the Ship in the Hole, which was right next to the river down by Swan Hunter's shipyard. Now, when this pub was demolished, probably about 20 or 30 years ago, this gave an opportunity for archaeologists to go in and dig around that area. And what was discovered there was the original bathhouse for the fort at Segedunum. You can see in the background there, the red brick building, the red roofed building rather, is the reconstructed bathhouse. But what you can see here in the foreground is the original bathhouse. That was first bathhouse was built there during the time of Hadrian, and you can just see in the way that the ground has been laid out here. There's an end of a building there, a circular, semicircular end of the building, and here these little pillars, these little stone pillars or terracotta brick pillars, were part of the heating system. They were part of the hypocaust system, and these pillars were built up with the floor level on top, and the hot air could be circulated through this area to heat the bathhouse inside. So this was part of the WallQuest project. The archaeology here was completed about 5 or 6 years ago, and that's now been opened and displayed so that you can go in and actually visit inside that part of the reconstructed bathhouse. And here we've got an image of what the bathhouse would have looked like. On the right-hand side, this was what it was like when it was constructed during the time of Hadrian. Towards the sorry, that's the left-hand side. On the red side is the Hadrianic side, and on the blue side, on the right-hand side, this is probably about 150 to 200 years later. And what had happened over that period of time is the river at the bottom part of this picture, the river had encroached on the bathhouse, and actually there'd been some subsidence. And although they did build buttresses and something sort of strong to keep the walls up, some of the walls had collapsed. So this was redesigned during the time after Hadrian. But this plan of the bathhouse, you can see this along Hadrian's Wall at Chester's fort particularly. It's like a little circuit, so the men can go into the vestibule, take off their clothes and get prepared for the bath. Then going into the warm room where they just get the temperature up a little bit, and then the hot room, which would be a hot steamy room and a hot sweaty room where they would get cleaned and use oil to clean their skin. Then go back into the warm room, and then cooling off in the cold room before they went back out into the fort. And of course, with about 400 or 500 soldiers on any fort, it was really important to keep them clean and really important to keep them healthy. Quite often you found the bathhouses on the outside of the fort, though, because of fire, because of a lot of the buildings on the fort had wooden roofs, and it was a fire risk. So the furnaces and the bathhouses were on the outside of the fort, which is what we found at Wallsend. Now this is a reconstruction inside Wallsend Fort, a reconstruction of the bathhouse. And this is the vestibule. This is the place where the soldiers would get changed and get their clothes off before they went into the bath. And this is very much based on what was found at Chester's Fort, just a few miles along Hadrian's Wall. You can see this is the original bathhouse here, and these 7 little niches along the wall, which are probably used for storage. There is one line of thought that said it was a place for worship, but that's really not very likely in a bathhouse. So this was a place where the soldiers would get prepared on their way into their bath, and their time of relaxation and a time to warm up as well. Now, I've mentioned Wallsend. Wallsend you can see at the far left of the picture here, and then to the top of the picture is South Shields. Now, South Shields, there was another Roman fort built at South Shields, but it wasn't actually part of Hadrian's Wall. It was separate from Hadrian's Wall. But this was a fort that was used mainly as a supply base, being right by the river. The goods were brought in from other parts of the Roman Empire, so things were imported for the soldiers to eat, and then they travelled up by river and took the supplies further up into Newcastle, into Wallsend, and up towards the countryside using the river. Much more efficient as a means of transport than the road system at that time. So if you go to the fort at South Shields, the fort which was called Arbea during the Roman times, probably meaning the place of the Arabs, South Shields is really quite different to anywhere else that you'll find along Hadrian's Wall, because at South Shields there was a massive programme in the 1970s and 1980s of reconstruction of buildings along the wall. And it's one of my favourite places to visit because it's brilliant to actually see things as they stood. So what you've got here is a reconstructed gateway, very typical of what you'll see along Hadrian's Wall. You can see the 2 doorways, so it was known as a twin portal gateway. For some reason, a lot of the gateways in Hadrian's Wall, one of the doors was blocked up not long after building, and we don't really know why. But you can see here that the gateway standing to its full height, and although the walls haven't been reconstructed beyond what you can see here, also along in Arbea there are a number of buildings that have been reconstructed on the site of the original buildings. One of these is the commanding officer's house. Now, this is based on a Roman villa, and to be fair, there weren't that many fancy Roman villas in the north, because up here in the north we were a military zone. This was not a place where people came for rest and relaxation. So the only very grand, very fine buildings that you'll find along the wall are the ones that were lived in by the commanding officer. And here you can see a little courtyard with a little garden on the right hand side. And inside of the building, this has actually been reconstructed to show part of the bedroom of the commanding officer. So very, very high quality furniture, high quality painting, because the commanding officer was a really high ranking officer in the Roman army. He'd come from Rome usually, he'd come from Italy, and he'd come to command the men here for a short period of time before moving up the ranks. But in comparison to that, this is where the soldiers got to live. This is a part of a barrack block that's been reconstructed at at Arbea. And what you can see here is just one barrack block. There would have been lines and lines of these blocks, cheek by jowl, all the way across the extent of the fort. And inside of these blocks, much more basic accommodation. Over on the left-hand side, likely that the soldiers themselves got to stay maybe 6 or 8 to a room in bunk beds like this, and not very much socialising space at all. And the room on the right-hand side is more likely to have been that of a centurion, something a little bit more spacious and a bit better quality. So a real contrast between what the men of the soldiers got to live in and the commanding officer himself. Some things have never changed. Now, coming out of Wallsend and going back in towards the city centre, in towards Newcastle, there's not really a great deal of Hadrian's Wall to be seen, but you can still see the line of the wall in the street system here. So this is the Fossway coming in towards the city centre, and then as you get closer to the city centre, Shields Road follows the line of Hadrian's Wall. And what you can see here is archaeologists working at the time where the new swimming pool was being built in Shields Road, about 20 years ago. And this is a part of the wall running across the centre of the picture here. And then beside the wall, you can see these pits, these unusual shaped pits. And what these pits have been identified as is somewhere that were used for obstacles to be sunk. So wooden obstacles, perhaps pieces of tree, you know, sort of spikes from trees were actually stuck in there to prevent people attacking the wall, another line of defence for the wall. And this is the only place on Hadrian's Wall that these were found. Until quite recently, something similar was found at Wall's End. So if you go along that stretch of Shields Road today, you can see that part of the wall here has been preserved, right just outside the swimming pool here, and just amongst all the shops in Shields Road. Now, from Shields Road coming into town, the wall, little fragments, little bits and pieces of wall along the Ousburn area, but because of the industrial development there, there's very, very little to see. It's not really until you get west of the city centre that you see much more of Hadrian's Wall. But this photograph was taken from the top of the castle, and this looks down onto the river, and you can see obviously the Tyne Bridge there, but you can see the swing bridge on the right hand side of the picture, and the swing bridge probably stood on the site of the original Roman bridge of Newcastle. We don't know exactly where it was, but the castle, the first little fortlet that was built in Newcastle, was likely to have been there to have guarded that river crossing. And the very first bridge in Newcastle was known as Pons Aelius. Pons from the Latin pon meaning bridge, and Aelius, well, that was actually Hadrian's name. He was called Hadrianus Aelius. So that bridge was named after Hadrian. So it's likely that Hadrian probably visited at the time that that bridge was being built in AD 122. And it was that time that the decision to build Hadrian's Wall was made. We know exactly what the Roman bridge looked like, but this is a reconstruction of the Roman bridge at Chester's Fort, a little bit further up the Tyne. And it's quite likely that the one at Newcastle did look rather like this. So an arched bridge going across the river with a little, not exactly a fortress, but a little, a small turret or watchtower on each side of the bridge. But now, all we've got left, as we saw earlier in Newcastle, is just in the line of the ground by the castle. You can see the layout of some of this little fortress. And it was built a little bit after the time of Hadrian. The actual main fortress there was built after the time of Hadrian. So because there's not an awful lot above ground in Newcastle to see, one of the best places to go in Newcastle to find out about Hadrian's Wall is the Great North Museum, the Great North Museum Hancock, which is just north of the city centre. And one of my favourite exhibits here is this huge model, this scale model running right across the middle of this building, which shows Hadrian's Wall, shows a scale model of Hadrian's Wall snaking across the countryside. And then behind that, what you've got is an interactive model of the wall. And you can have a go putting your name. You can just see the little bricks in the wall there with people's initials in. So you can virtually put your name on Hadrian's Wall. And if you wait there long enough, every now and again it starts raining and you see the soldier just wiping his brow and cursing the rain up here in the north. So Great North Museum, open to the public now, and a great place to go and visit. Not just the model of the wall, but there are a number of fabulous artefacts there, and showing not just what was found locally, but what was found also on other parts of Hadrian's Wall across Northumberland. Now, in Newcastle city centre, there isn't a great deal of the wall still to be seen. But what we've got is in the street layout, sometimes it's not very obvious, but sometimes it can be seen. So this is taken with the railway station to our right-hand side from Westgate Road, looking back down along Westgate Road. And just behind these buildings, that's where the castle is. This is the site of the original Roman little fortress. And this line of the wall here, can you see on the pavement, there's a little paler coloured area in the pavement. That marks the line of Hadrian's Wall as it came through the centre of Pons Aelius, later to become Newcastle. Now, very close to the railway station, just on the other side of the railway station, is the site of a mile castle. Earlier on we saw that lovely Lego model of the fortress of one of the Roman forts, but this is a model of a mile castle. A mile castle quite a bit smaller than a Roman fort. These mile castles only held probably about 20 men. There were rooms either side for the men to sleep in. But these mile castles controlled the passage of people through the wall. And believe it or not, they were built just about every mile. So from Hadrian's Wall, from coast to coast, 80 Roman miles, you actually find 80 sites of mile castles. In between the mile castle, every third of a mile, there was a smaller, like a little watchtower called a turret. But mile castle number 4, so 4 miles from the beginning, was found on very close to the railway station at Newcastle, just behind the Westgate Art Centre on Westgate Road. This was discovered about 20 years ago, where the guy that has the pottery studio there, when some work was being done in the courtyard, he discovered fragments of ancient pottery, and he was really interested, so he got involved in helping with the dig, and they discovered the remains of Mile Castle number 4 in the grounds of this little art centre now. So it has been preserved a little bit. It's a bit difficult to see, but you can see some of the paving there of Mile Castle number 4. Now, going back out on Westgate Road, this picture was taken looking back into the city. Again, you can see that line of the road, not a Roman road, but following the line of the Roman wall, a long straight wall as it went out into the countryside across towards Carlisle. And a little bit further up the wall, a little bit further up the road, just in the middle of a 1930s housing estate, is something really quite unique. This is a temple to a local god called Antennakyticus. Now, Antennakyticus isn't celebrated anywhere else in the Roman world, only here on the fort of Benwell. Now, Benwell Fort in Roman times, in Latin, was known as Condacum Fort, and Condacum means a good view. It means a good place. So from this fort, fabulous view down into the Tyne Valley, but very, very unusual. On the site of Benwell Fort was this little temple to the god Antennakyticus. And you can see some altars in the temple here. These altars are replicas. The originals are now in the Great North Museum. But quite unusually, as I said, nobody's ever heard of Antennakyticus outside of Benwell, outside of Newcastle. And it's thought that he was some sort of local Celtic god, Celtic deity that was worshipped by the Romans. And here you can see an idea of what that temple might have looked like, a stone structure with plaster on the outside of it, with a roof, a terracotta roof on the outside of the fort. Now, as I said, those altars are no longer in situ. The altars have been put into the Great North Museum. They're on display there. And as well as the altars, there was a statue of Antennakyticus, and his head is on display in the Great North Museum. And one of the altars was dedicated by a soldier called Tinius Longus, and he gave a dedication towards Antennakyticus, and that's inscribed on the altar there. So these are on display in the Great North Museum. A little bit further west on the same housing estate is what's known as a vallum crossing. Now, I mentioned the wall that you saw earlier on across the country with the ditches either side of it. The ditch to the south of the wall was known as the vallum, and this was, rather than a defensive ditch, this was more like a marking of the military way. And in Benwell, this stone crossing that you can see the ditch running diagonally across, and then the stone crossing that you can see here was a way of getting through the vallum without having to go into the ditch and get your feet wet. And what this would have looked like in Roman times, it would have had some kind of gateway across the vallum as a way of preventing unauthorised access into the fortress itself. So quite unusual. In the 1930s, these were discovered by archaeologists, but the housing estate was still built and built around them. And actually the fort of Benwell no longer exists. There was a water reservoir built on top of Benwell, unfortunately. And one final thing really before we leave Newcastle is going out again on the West Road. This is part of what's known as Denton Hall Turret. And I mentioned earlier on that we saw mile castles, which were smaller than the fortresses, and these turrets were smaller again. These turrets were little buildings, 2 stories high, which were used initially as watchtowers. And this, the main road, the West Road, is just to the right-hand side of this picture here. But there's a reconstruction here of what this turret would have looked like. This is taken from Vindolanda. If you've ever visited Vindolanda, there are reconstructions there of turrets and the original wall that you can see. So this is an idea of what the turret would have looked like, a 2-story building where the soldiers could have been lookout on the top there, and not likely to have slept here. It's probably thought that the turrets were used by the soldiers who were stationed at the mile castles, and they just kept temporary guard here. So that's about it. Just as you're leaving Newcastle, just as you're going out of the city centre, I'm sure a lot of you have probably driven along the A69 going out towards Hexham and perhaps never even noticed this. But if you look alongside the trees here on the left-hand side, in the line of the trees is the final fragments that you'll see of Hadrian's Wall before you leave Tyneside for Northumberland, built right alongside the A69. In fact, the A69 for quite a bit of this way follows the line of the wall, and as you go out into the countryside, Hadrian's Wall has been covered over by the building of the military road. So going into Northumberland, going up towards Headon on the Wall, this picture was taken from a little bit further than that, but you can't actually see much of the wall now. You can just see these lumps and bumps, these folds in the fields that give you an indication of where the wall once was. So you have to have your wits about you, you have to sort of know what you're looking for. But we're very fortunate that when you do go back into Newcastle and to Tyneside, we've got 3 fabulous museums. There's Arbeia, Segedunum and the Great North Museum, which, as well as reconstructions, have got many, many artefacts from Hadrian's Wall, so telling us a little bit about the history of what we've got under our feet. So I've used in this little show, I've used quite a lot of images from Hadrian's Wall on Tyneside book by Dr. Nick Hodgson, which was published by TWAMS, Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums. Some of the photographs were from Graham Peacock from that book. And also they're taken from the WallQuest information. WallQuest has a really good website, although the project is no longer running. There's quite a lot of information about Hadrian's Wall on Tyneside on the website. And the other images were taken from Newcastle Libraries, from English Heritage, from Vindolanda, and from Bricks to the Past and the Environment Agency. So I do hope you've enjoyed that, and look forward to the next one when I'll show you around Hadrian's Wall going across Northumberland.